Today I'm going to do something different and talk about my favorite indie game developer John Schaefer and his rise and fall. So inside this video, you're going to learn how a game developer successfully marketed their indie game, built an audience of diehard fans, got funded over 100 grand, and got gamers to buy his pre-orders for $50. But in the end, the project failed. So this is a cautionary tale about John Schaefer. So Shafer started his own indie game studio back in 2012. And by 2013, he got funded for over 100 grand for his early access game At the Gates. And he was also making extra money selling pre-orders on Steam for $50. And it's crazy, right? $50 for an indie game, especially a pre-order, right? And like I said, this is my favorite indie game developer. And what he was trying to do in, my favorite genre, the 4X genre was, kind of cool. So I forked over my $50 and I pre-ordered the game on Steam. Anyway, so for about 2 to 3 years, the game progressed pretty good, right? His development was going pretty good. But around 2015, updates on Kickstarters were slowing down. And by 2017, people were, kind of getting angry because how slow things were going, right? And then by 2020, I think that was his last, update. And then, it's 2025 and basically the game is pretty much dead. So then the question is, how did Shafer get so much success in just 1 year? And then how did he lose it all when he had so much momentum and so many fans, supporting him financially? Well, here's some insights from Shafer's story so that, you can get the same success with your small indie game, but at the same time, avoid all his mistakes and so that you don't fail the same way, right? Okay, so here's insight number 1, and that is be prolific and you'll succeed. So Shafer was the lead programmer for Civ 5. And at first glance, you might think that this is the biggest reason why Shafer's indie game, At the Gates, was a huge success in terms of getting funding and getting a big audience. And yeah, maybe his name in the 4X gaming community, helped a lot, but I like to go a little bit deeper and I like to find, the non-obvious reasons why some video games sell and some don't. So what I think is the reason why Shafer's indie game was a success was not because of his resume or his name. It's because he was prolific at, indirectly marketing himself. So let me show you what I mean. So before Shafer was hired on by Firaxis, he started off by modding Civ 3 and Civ 4. He built a name for himself in that modding community, right? And he was known as Trip, right? And Trip was one of the best modders for Civ 3 and 4. And he also wrote a guide on how to, mod Civ 4 using Python. And so this got him attention from Firaxis, and then he got hired on to help, program Civ 4 expansion packs, right? Warlords and Beyond the Sword. Anyway, from there, he landed his role as the lead programmer for Civ 5. He then left Firaxis in 2011, but he didn't stop being prolific. He didn't stop, writing or talking about, this 4X genre. So what he did was he started a devlog, John Schaefer on design.com. He also started a podcast with a friend talking about video games and board game design called Game Design Roundtable. So by 2013, he built an audience of fans through, his podcast and his devlog. So when he launched his Kickstarter in 2013, this is how he was able to get over, 100 grand in funding so quickly. And this is why he was able to sell pre-orders for the indie game for, $50. Now, what worked in 2013 is not going to work today in 2025. So in other words, just because you have a devlog or a podcast, it doesn't mean, gamers are going to line up and listen and then support you financially, right? But here's the insight I want you to learn because the fundamentals are still there. So Shafer's success came to him after he put a lot of time, free time into something, right? He did modding for free. He wrote a guide to help other modders for free. He was, prolific doing, just basically doing stuff, right? And this is what got him attention from Firaxis. And then after that, he still wrote in his devlog and he had a podcast, right? And this might not seem like a big deal, but he was one of the first, indie game developers to have a devlog and a podcast because back then no one was doing that kind of stuff, especially in 2011, right? And this is a really important tidbit because there's a lot of platforms today that don't seem like good places to talk about video games, right? Most people go on TikTok or Twitter or on Reddit to talk about their indie game, right? But if you want to get attention, you can't go where everyone else is going, right? You got to, take a risk and try something different. And I'll talk about this later in the step-by-step guide, but let's keep going because again, Shafer was prolific and almost all of the stuff he did was on his free time and he just put out content and gamers and fans, gravitated to that, right? And this is what I mean when I say he indirectly marketed himself. While he was, helping other people with his content, his guides, his podcasts, he was also marketing his name. And because he talked about his genre like a fan would, that's what resonated me to him and a lot of players to him, right? So for example, he talked a lot about, the mid game and the late game in 4X games that basically bog you down and then it gets really unmanageable late in the late game, right? And then he talked about ways how he could fix the problem. And this resonated with me and other, fans of the 4X genre because basically I was, fatigued playing, the same 4X games because there's a lot of copycat games. But here's, a small indie game dev trying to innovate, trying to add new, fresh ideas. And this is really what got my attention and other people's attention. And if you noticed in all of my indie game marketing tips, there's one common theme that I always talk about, and that is figure out what problems, issues, and frustrations your potential customer has in your genre, and then talk about how your game, fixes those problems, because this is how you get people's attention. Because basically when you show and tell them that you understand what they want and then they need, and then talk about how your game, solves those wants and needs, that's how you get attention. And so because Shafer understood what players, want and hate in a 4X genre, this resonated with people, right? And this is why people supported him, and gave him $50 for, an indie game pre-order, right? He knew what we wanted from a 4X game, and he set out to fix the problems and give us something new, fresh, and innovative. And so as his fan base grew and word of mouth spread, this got the attention from other, bigger game devs. And then they started, spreading word of mouth. And this word of mouth spread outside of Shafer's own small audience into a bigger audience. So it wasn't because Shafer was the lead programmer for Civ 5 that got his indie game to, become a success. It was because he was prolific, right? He put out his content and helped, people. He talked about problems and frustrations in this genre, and then he talked about how he wanted to fix them, and that resonated with people and not just other game devs. And he did it all for free, right? He put in the work. He didn't just sit in his room and, code a video game and then release it and hope that people will find it. But despite everything, you'll soon learn about Shafer's downfall and what made him lose everything he worked so hard to build up. So let's keep going, and let's talk about insight number 2, and that is, the more you tell, the more you sell. So marketing is all about communicating, right? And like I said, the saying goes, the more you tell, the more you sell. This saying is true because it's people that talk most about something that get all the attention and that get all the rewards, basically. So for example, Christopher Columbus, discovered America. So why isn't America called Columbia, right? That's because Columbus didn't believe the land he discovered was a new continent, right? He thought it was India, basically. But Amerigo Vespucci, another explorer, talked about the new world, right? He wrote about it. He published it in a famous letter called the Mundus Novus, in which he talked about the new world and how it's a continent all on its own and it's not India. And because he wrote many letters about this topic, for this, Amerigo's name is what was put on the new continent and not Columbus's, right? You see what I mean? The more you tell, the more you sell. And so what I'm saying is Shafer was prolific. He wrote about game dev and design back in 2011, and not a lot of game devs were doing that, especially small indie game devs. And he put a lot of hours into, his podcast. He basically put himself out there, creating a lot of content, putting in, a lot of free time into, basically marketing, right? But this is why most indie game studios don't get any traction, is because they don't consistently talk enough, right? And when they do talk, it's about them or their game, and they never appreciate what their target player wants to hear, right? It's basically self-promotion, and self-promotion is not how to get traction. Or worse, a game studio will start talking about their game, 3 months before their game launch. And when you're a small indie game dev, 3 months is not enough time to build an audience. And so this is the biggest takeaway I want you to get from this insight. It takes years to build an audience. So it's important to start early. And this is what Shafer did, right? He spent about, 2 years talking about his game ideas. He didn't build a game and then start talking. He started talking and then got a small audience and then started building his game. But even though Shafer was successful at marketing his game and, building an audience, he ran into some troubles. So here's insight number 3, and that is other people's money is a recipe for disaster. So getting other people to help fund your indie game, sounds like an intuitive thing to do, right? It feels like it's the only option indie game devs have, because without, funding, there's no way the game could be made. And so indie game devs set out to get, outside cash. They go to investors, they go to Kickstarter, or they, try to attract a publisher, or they try to use Patreon. So they want outside cash so they don't have to worry about how they'll, support themselves while they're making their game. And this makes sense, and it sounds like an ideal situation. You get all the money you need, to help you support your life. You can make your game, and you don't have to worry about, having a day job. You can build your game and not worry, where the money is coming from, right? But spending other people's money sounds easy, but there's a hidden catch. And Shafer realized this right away. First of all, trying to raise funds is distracting, and it will take away months or years away from your life, and it takes away from what you love to do, right? And your focus, and that is, making a quality game. And in one of, Shafer's devlog entries titled Trials and Tribulations of Kickstarter, he explains it perfectly. He says, many people don't realize creators ultimately end up with a fairly small slice of the Kickstarter pie. You can immediately cut 20% off the top due to processing fees and failed transactions. Then there's the cost of fulfilling rewards and marketing. Yes, that's important. Both planned and unplanned contract work licensing multiple software packages, and the list goes on. So basically that's what he said. And so you don't realize how much of a drain, raising money is. And even when you get the money, how much of that pie you don't really get. And other people's money is not free, right? You do have to eventually pay it back, because investors expect a return. Also, people who funded you, especially on Kickstarter, will hound you and demand your game when it's, past due, its due day, right? And this will take a toll on your mental health, and as it did for Shafer. So the reason why other people's money is a recipe for failure is because you put all your focus on how you're going to get money and less focus on building a great video game. So other people's money is not sustainable, and you get addicted to it, and you need it in order to survive, right? And Shafer learned this lesson hard. He ran out of money, and that's why, updates slowed down. And because his game scope was too big, he got into game dev hell, and, development took longer than he wanted. And then he started getting negative feedback from his backers. And so Shafer's mental and physical health, deteriorated. And all of this stuff, spiraled into less and less work, less effort into the game, and then less communication. So when you use other people's money, you also lose, control of your game. Your funders and your investors and your backers now become your boss, and they have expectations, and they make you do stuff that you don't want to do, and that will put a toll on your mental and your physical health. Okay, so what's the lesson here? How can you use this cautionary tale to help you, build an audience and launch a successful indie game? So here's the number one lesson. Expect to spend half your time looking for customers and the other working on your game. So when a game dev works for a studio, they don't have to worry about, getting customers. They don't have to worry about, stuff like the finances and the accounting. And for the most part, they don't have to worry about, the paperwork and the admin stuff. Their job is mostly spent on developing a game and then probably meetings and other little admin stuff, right? And yeah, this can be a grind, and there's a lot of pressure to, get your work done, but they spend probably 90% of their time developing and not worrying about the business activities at all, especially trying to get customers. But the minute they step out on their own and, they start their own game studio, these game developers realize that there is no buffer between them and the customer. Because you see, the company was in charge of finding customers, marketing, promotion, and creating content, right? So the company was a buffer between the game dev and the customer. And then once the game dev starts on their own, starts their own studio, that buffer is all gone. And now it hits them. Oh shit, my employer no longer pays me. I don't have a wage. I got to find customers because it's the customers that will pay my wage. So when this oh shit, moment happens, their first instinct is to, find another buffer between them and the customer. And that's why, Kickstarter or Patreon or finding a publisher is so important to them, is because it adds an extra buffer between them and the customers, and they don't have to worry about finding customers. The publisher will do that, and they can just focus on, making the game. And hey, don't get me wrong. If you're lucky to get, a successful Kickstarter, or you can find a publisher or get some Patreon money, then great. That's awesome. But the reality is most small indie game devs don't. It's really hard to find investors. And that's the lesson here. When you start your own game studio, all that stuff that buffers you when you were an employee is gone, right? And now it's just you, your game, and your customer, and it's your job to find those customers. You got to realize that no one's going to be lining up to play your game. It's up to you, your responsibility, to find those customers. Also, your income isn't guaranteed like it was when you were employed, right? And finding a publisher or investor isn't only hard to do, but isn't, necessarily always the answer, because now you have new bosses, pressuring you and telling you what to do. So it's a shock to the game dev now, because now they have to find the customers. And if they can't find the customers, they hope, a publisher will do that. And if they can't find the publisher, what they do next is they hope to get lucky that maybe a YouTuber will cover their game, or a game journalist will talk about them. And then their game blows up, and all they have to do is sit back, work on their game, and then the YouTubers or the game journalists will help them find customers. But the reality is most small indie game studios fail because they fail to get customers and fail to build an audience. And Shafer was good at, finding customers and getting, an audience and getting funding. But his mistake was that his scope was too big. And then his backers turned on him when the game was taking too long to develop and to finish. And then he stopped communicating with those customers. So let's put this lesson into action. Let's use Shafer's best strategy in building a fan base, and let's apply it to your own game. So here's what to do. So in this part, I want to talk about your action plan, and that is how to create content that resonates with your target audience and how to build that audience. So a lot of game devs are looking for that buffer between them and the customer. So in other words, they don't want to spend time looking for customers. They want other people to do that, right? But if they can't find a publisher or investor or backers or even a YouTuber or, game journalist, then you got to put in the work. Again, there is no shortcuts in business. So let's get to work. Okay. So it's not 2011 anymore. Devlogs, podcasts, even social media is basically oversaturated. Again, that's because the marketplace is, oversaturated with new indie games being published every day, and everybody is, using the same platforms trying to promote their game. So it's a very noisy place, and it's really hard for small indie game devs to get heard. But the fundamentals never change. Just like Amerigo Vespucci did in 1500, and just like Shafer did in 2011, the idea is the same. The more you tell, the more you sell. And the platform might, change. Amerigo's platform was letters, and, Shafer's was devlog and podcast. The platform always changes, but the strategy never does. And that is talk about your stuff as much as you can. So here's your action plan right now. So the best platform to talk about your game isn't YouTube, isn't Reddit, Twitter, or TikTok. And like I said, those platforms are oversaturated. So let me show you a better strategy into where to post your content so you can get the attention of your target player. Okay, so here's step one. Figure out what you have in common with your target player. So I read all of Shafer's devlogs and I listened to all of the podcasts that he was in up to 2014. And he rarely talked about technical stuff about game dev. He mostly talked about the problems and frustrations with the 4X genre, and he talked about ideas on how to improve on them. And this fresh take, this innovative, talk about my favorite genre is what got me interested and got a lot of people interested about what he was doing. So for example, he talked about how he loved Spelunky, right? And he talked about his ideas on how he could incorporate roguelike elements into a 4X game, right? And remember, this was 2012. These ideas were new and fresh. And again, this is why players gravitated to his content, because Shafer was talking about new and innovative ideas for the 4X genre. Anyway, my point is, what do you and your target player have in common, right? It's probably not about Unity code. It's not about programming. And it's probably not about how to draw pixel or polygon art. The only thing you as a game developer and your target player have in common is that you both love a certain genre. So start there. And then when you publish content, only focus on that genre, on that topic. And this might seem simple, but if your content is all over the place, like, so for example, you talk about anime or movies and then about other video games or other genres, then you won't attract your target player, right? You need to focus on that one thing you have in common. So stay focused on what you and your target player have in common, and that is your genre. Okay, next, step 2, and that is talk about your new, fresh, innovative ideas you want to bring to the genre. So the thing is, self-promotion is often ignored, and talking about you and about your game doesn't get attention, especially if you're a small indie game dev. And yeah, if you become huge and a lot of people know you, then sure, you can talk about what you want, but not right now. Right now, when you're small and nobody knows you, it's important to put your ego aside and put the spotlight on the player. And I'll show you how to unpack that later. But right now, what I want you to know is that this is how you get traction, is when you put the spotlight on the player. So the question is, if you can't talk about you and about your game, then what do you talk about? Again, focus all your content on your genre, because again, that's what you have in common with the player, your target player. And what you talk about is your passion for your genre. So for example, here's some ideas I came up with, topics, right? So what are the 10 things you love about your genre? What are 10 things you hate about your genre? What are the top favorite games in your genre? What games ruined your genre, right? What are games that pushed the genre even further? What are the top 3 games in your genre that inspired you to make your current game? What are 3 things you're doing right now to innovate your genre? How are you incorporating different, elements from other genres into your genre? These are the topics that will connect you with your target player. And that's because it's not about you. It's not about, self-promotion. It's mostly about them and how it relates to them. And the good thing is that as a game dev, you have a certain authority over, players. You've probably thought about your genre and understand it better than, most players that just play video games. And because you're a player and also a developer, you have insights about your genre that not a lot of players have, heard of, right? And this love for your genre is what motivated you to make your own game. And this passion will resonate with players, and this passion is what will help you, attract players. All right, then now let's talk about how to actually attract these players. So in step 3, post your content on Steam Community Hub, in the news section or itch.io. So in 2011, it was a risk to put up a blog and create a podcast, especially for a small indie game developer. And that's because how will people find it, right? SEO and Google, the big name developers got all that, space. As a small indie game dev, it was really hard to get attention. But the thing is, once you start creating content, people will start finding you, the ball will start rolling, and you will start getting some attention. But you got to be consistent. But then what happens is, as these platforms, start working, and other game developers use them as a way to self-promote, they become oversaturated, and it gets harder and harder to get noticed. So, podcasts and, own personal blogs, they're kind of hard to get any attention today. And then what about social media, right? Well, how many people are on TikTok looking for small, innovative, indie games, right? There's not a lot. And most people on social media are there for other reasons other than, window shopping for, small indie game devs that are trying to be innovative. Plus, you're fighting against an algorithm that changes all the time. And so now you're just chasing an algorithm and trying to make content to, make sure that you're not buried. So this is why I encourage you to use Steam Community Hub, especially the news section, to post your content, or, even use itch.io. And the reason is Steam basically gives you an easy way to publish content. But the biggest reason actually is that's, where your gamers are hanging out, right? People are on Steam or even itch.io, to find new games. So use the news tab as your devlog, and remember to talk about topics that your fans, can resonate with. So again, see step number 2. And sure, post, updates and talk about your game as well, but put the spotlight always on the player. So what do I mean when I say, put the spotlight on the player? So there will be times where you will self-promote and talk about your game, and that's fine, right? You can always sprinkle that into your, devlog. But to make it more interesting to the player, I want you to always answer the question, and how does it benefit the player? So for example, you want to talk about a new feature you're working on, right? So instead of just showing off the feature and showing off how it works, always ask yourself, how will this feature benefit the player? And remember, the more you post on Steam or even itch.io, the more traction you will get. And there's no such thing as overnight success. Unfortunately, it takes time to build an audience, but that's okay. It's worth the time because this is how you, market your game. This is how you build an audience, and this is how you increase your chances of a successful game launch. So here's your action step right now. So get into your Steam Community Hub, the news section, or go into itch.io and write a quick note about 10 things you love about your genre, and then relate it back to how your love of your genre inspired you to make your game, right? So yeah, you are talking about your game, but you're doing it in a way that will resonate with the player. And the thing is, you got to make a commitment to do this at least once a week, right? And if you run out of ideas, then go, back to step number 2 and read, the list of topics I came up with. But I promise you, once you get started, you'll always come up with new ideas. And it's okay to post updates and talk about, purely about your game, about features and stuff that you're doing, but make sure to, bring it back to the player and then show them the benefit of what you're doing. So do that right now. It doesn't matter how far you're into game development. The idea here is to start building an audience as soon as you can. And these will be the people that will wishlist your game. There will be the people that buy your game at launch. So it's worth the time and effort to start doing this right now and as early as you can. All right, my name is Dariusz. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you in the next video. Later.